Ever think about how a simple piece of old pottery could actually whisper secrets from thousands of years ago? Okay, let's unpack this because we've got some, well, frankly, mind-bending new research that does exactly that.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it, how these really precise scientific tools now let us get this sort of chemical snapshot of the really distant past.
Exactly. So we're diving deep into a new study today. It's unearthed the oldest solid evidence, the earliest known proof of a specific plant being used way back in ancient Arabia.
And it's quite a specific plant, too.
It is not just any old weed, right? We're talking about Peganum harmala. You might know it as Syrian rue or harmal.
Mm-hmm.
And you might have even heard of it because it still pops up today, in traditional medicine and even some psychoactive practices.
Yeah, and if you zoom out for a second, it's just remarkable how long humans have been, experimenting with and really relying on the plant world for health, for well-being.
And maybe even for, altering consciousness.
Potentially, yes.
So our mission today, our deep dive, is to try and figure out how and crucially why this harmal plant was being used nearly 2,700 years ago, way back in the Iron Age.
And the clues.
The clues are pretty wild. They were found in the leftover gunk, the residue, inside these ancient burners or fumigation devices.
Which raises a really fascinating question. How on earth do you even start analyzing something that's been sitting in the ground for millennia and figure out what it actually is?
Right. Well, this specific research focused on an archaeological site called Qurayyah. It's in northwestern Saudi Arabia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was a pretty significant settlement back in the Iron Age, and it's known for its really beautiful, quite distinctive decorated pottery. And this study was a great team effort, a collaboration between the Max Planck Institute, the University of Vienna, and also the Saudi Ministry of Culture.
That kind of international teamwork is often where the really exciting discoveries happen, bringing different experts together.
Couldn't agree more. And the real breakthrough, the thing that made this possible, was the incredibly advanced way they analyze these tiny bits of residue. It's called advanced metabolic profiling.
Okay.
Think of it like CSI, but for the ancient world.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
It really is. And the results they've managed to get are, well, they're quite illuminating.
Absolutely. So, okay, let's get right into what they actually found. This research gives us the earliest physical proof, and I really want to stress that, physical proof that harmal was being burned.
Right. Not just finding seeds, but evidence of burning.
Exactly. And this isn't just the oldest evidence in Arabia. It's the oldest we've found anywhere in the world. And that's thanks to some very precise dating techniques on the samples.
Radiocarbon dating, presumably.
Yes, exactly. Now, here's where it gets really interesting.
What makes this finding so significant, I think, is that we're not just finding, like you said, seeds or plant bits. We're actually detecting the unique chemical fingerprints left behind, specifically when it's burned.
Yes. These fingerprints, these remnants, were found inside these fumigation devices. You can imagine them as, I guess, ancient incense burners.
Sort of, yeah.
Sensors. Right, sensors. They dug them up from the residential parts of Qurayyah, dating back to the Iron Age. Specifically, they found them in a courtyard in one area, Area D, and also in the food production area and maybe a cellar of what looked like quite an elite dwelling, a fancy house, in another part, Area N.
So different contexts within the settlement.
It really gives you a sense of where these activities were happening, in people's actual daily lives.
And the fact they were found in homes rather than, say, temples or public buildings.
Yeah.
Well, that strongly suggests the use of harmal was probably a regular part of domestic life, wouldn't you say?
I think so. And Dr. Barbara Huber, who led the study, she actually said their findings provide chemical evidence for the earliest known burning of harmal, not just in Arabia, but globally. Yeah. And she also pointed out how this really helps us understand how these ancient communities were using their knowledge of local plants, for health, maybe cleaning their spaces.
And potentially for altering states of mind, too, as she mentioned.
Right. And Professor Marta Luciani, she's the archaeology director, she emphasized how powerful it is when you combine the digging things up, the archaeology, with this really detailed scientific analysis that lets us understand not just what plants were around, but where they were used, how they were used, and maybe even get closer to why.
That's the key, isn't it? Moving beyond just presence to actual use.
And how they figured it out is pretty amazing science. They used a technique called high-performance liquid chromatography tandem mass spectrometry, HPLC-MS.
Right, sounds super technical.
It does. But basically, think of it like a highly sophisticated machine. It can separate all the tiny molecules in a sample, even a really old degraded one, and then identify them very, very precisely. This is how they could pinpoint specific harmala compounds like harmine and harmane, even in these ancient samples.
And they used a specific method within that, right? MRM?
Yeah, multiple reaction monitoring mode. What does that do exactly?
So MRM mode is kind of like having a special filter. It specifically looks for and detects even tiny, tiny amounts of those target harmala compounds, even when they're mixed in with a whole bunch of other stuff in the sample. It's very sensitive.
Okay, so it helps cut through the noise.
Precisely.
What's also really intriguing, though, is that one sample, they labeled it DAQUN2. It didn't have these harmful compounds in it at all.
So they were burning other things, too.
Looks like it. Which, yeah, we should definitely get into that a bit later.
That certainly suggests, doesn't it, that they weren't just using one single plant for fumigation. Maybe different substances had different purposes.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on. How could they be so sure that Peganum harmala was the source of these specific chemicals, harmine and harmane?
Well, the key piece of information here is that harmine and harmane, these alkaloids, they're naturally found in plants belonging to the Peganum genus, the Peganum family.
Right. But there are a few different kinds of Peganum plants, aren't there? So how did they narrow it down to harmala specifically?
Good question. They looked at the geography, basically. Where do these different Peganum species naturally grow around the world?
Okay.
And while the Peganum family is found in various places, Asia, North Africa, even parts of the Americas, Peganum harmala is the only one that's actually native, endemic to Saudi Arabia. The other species, they grow much further away, places like China, Mongolia, Russia.
So it just makes sense. Logistically, people in the Iron Age would have most likely used what was growing right there locally.
Exactly. You use what's available. They also had to consider if these chemicals could maybe have come from other plants entirely.
Right, because other plants do contain these compounds.
Some do, yes. For example, Passiflora incarnata, that's the passion flower, and also Banisteriopsis caapi, which you might know as the ayahuasca vine.
Okay, but these plants are native to the Americas. So it's incredibly unlikely, basically impossible. They were being used in Iron Age Arabia 2,700 years ago.
Right, the geography just completely rules them out. What about things like tobacco or coffee? I think the study mentioned they contain harmane too.
They did look at those, yeah. Harmane is present in tobacco smoke, for instance. But again, tobacco originated in the Americas. So that's out.
Okay, and coffee.
Coffee's interesting. It does contain harmane, and it's now grown, of course, nearby in places like Yemen. But it wasn't actually introduced to South Arabia from Ethiopia until around the 15th century AD.
Wow, okay, so that's a massive time difference. We're talking Iron Age Qurayyah versus, like, medieval times.
Exactly, over 2,000 years later. So when you put all the evidence together, the chemistry, the botany, the geography, Peganum harmala really stands out as the most logical, most plausible source. Okay, that seems pretty convincing. So we've got a good handle on what they were likely burning. Now let's delve into the why. What is it about these harmful chemicals, these alkaloids, that might have made them useful to these ancient people?
Right, this is where the science gets really interesting in terms of potential effects on the human body. Harmala alkaloids, harmine, the what we call reversible inhibitors of an enzyme called monoamine oxidase A.
MAOA.
Okay, hold on. MAOA inhibitor. What exactly does inhibiting MAOA do?
Okay, think of MAOA as like a cleanup crew in your brain. Its job is to break down certain chemical messengers, neurotransmitters, important ones like serotonin and norepinephrine.
Right, the mood regulators.
Exactly. So by inhibiting MAOA, harmala alkaloids basically slow down this breakdown process temporarily. That leads to higher levels of serotonin and norepinephrine hanging around in the brain.
And this can have a stimulating effect on the central nervous system. And it's thought to be connected to some of the therapeutic benefits people report from P-harmala. Essentially, it lets those feel-good chemicals stick around a bit longer.
So it's directly impacting brain chemistry? That's a pretty powerful effect for a plant.
It is. And importantly, unlike some other types of MAO inhibitors, these ones are reversible. That means the enzyme's activity can go back to normal after a while.
Okay.
Plus, these alkaloids don't just interact with MAOA, they can hit a range of other receptors in the body too, which probably contributes to their diverse effects. Sometimes calming or sedative, other times more stimulating.
And didn't you mention other properties too, like antibacterial?
Yes, exactly. They also possess known antibacterial, antiparasitic, and anti-inflammatory properties. Quite a broad spectrum.
Wow, that's quite the toolkit for one plant. So does that mean, depending on how much they use, the effect could have been quite different?
Precisely. It seems very dose-dependent. In smaller amounts, maybe inhaled from smoke, they might have acted as mild stimulants or had those therapeutic effects, anti-inflammatory, antibacterial.
Uh-huh.
But in larger doses, especially if ingested, they could potentially cause psychoactive effects, even hallucinations. And in very high doses, they can actually be quite toxic.
Right.
It's a good example of something called hormesis. The idea that a small amount of something can be beneficial, but too much is harmful.
So the Iron Age people likely had to figure out the right amount, the right preparation, probably through trial and error.
Just like humans have always done with potent plants, and frankly, how we still approach many medications today, finding that therapeutic window.
That's a really important point. Okay, so we know harmful alkaloids were definitely present in some of the burners, but you mentioned earlier they found other stuff too.
Yes, absolutely. In several samples, especially the ones from that courtyard area, Area D, the researchers found a significant amount of sterile molecules.
Sterols.
Things like campestrol, beta-sitosterol, stigmasterol, even some cholesterol, though likely plant-derived in this context, phytosterols.
Okay, and where would those typically come from?
Well, considering that pea harmless seeds are known to be quite rich in oil, it's very likely that these sterols actually originated from the seeds themselves being burned along with other parts, or perhaps primarily the seeds.
And do those sterols do anything?
Interestingly, yes. Scientific studies on modern pea harmala seed oil have shown it has anti-inflammatory properties. So it adds another potential layer to how this plant might have been used medicinally. Even the oily bits could have contributed.
Fascinating. Okay, what else?
Then in those 2 burners found in the Area N house, especially the one that didn't have any harmala alkaloids, remember DAQUN2?
Yeah, the odd one out.
In that one, they discovered compounds called pentacyclic triterpenoids, specifically things like alpha-amarin and beta-amarin and some related derivatives.
Okay, triterpenoids. Where do those come from?
These are more complex molecules, and they're commonly found throughout the plant kingdom, but especially in plant resins, things like balsams gums, particularly from plants in the Berseraceae family.
Berseraceae, like frankincense and myrrh.
Exactly. Frankincense and myrrh are probably the most famous members of that family, known for their aromatic resins. And these specific triterpenoids, the amarins, also have their own documented biological activities.
Such as?
Well, again, anti-inflammatory effects come up, but also potential antidepressant activity, and even protective effects on the digestive system, gastroprotective effects.
So in that one burner where they didn't find harmala, it seems like they were probably burning some kind of plant resin instead, maybe something related to frankincense or myrrh.
That certainly looks like the most plausible explanation for that sample, yes. But what's also really interesting is that in the other sample from Area N, DAQUN1, they actually found both the harmala alkaloids and these amarin resin compounds together in the same burner.
Whoa. So they were mixing them or using them sequentially.
It suggests that, doesn't it? Either mixing different substances, perhaps for a combined effect, or maybe using them one after the other in the same device for different reasons at different times. It hints at a kind of experimentation, maybe.
Yeah, like ancient apothecaries or maybe even perfumers trying out different recipes or combinations.
It does feel a bit like that.
Yeah.
We also see some interesting parallels and differences with other archaeological sites nearby in northwestern Arabia, places like Taima and Madain Salih.
Okay, what do they find there?
At those sites, researchers have also found amarin compounds, possibly from similar resins like LMI, often in incense burners. But and this seems to be a key difference, those finds are often in burial contexts like tombs. And crucially, harmala hasn't been identified in the settlement areas, the domestic context, at those other sites. Not yet, anyway.
So it looks like there might have been a specific pattern. Maybe harmala was used more in everyday domestic settings, like at Qurayyah, whereas other aromatic resins were maybe reserved more for ritualistic purposes, like funerals, at least in some places.
That's the picture that seems to be emerging from the current evidence, yes. It suggests a more specific, perhaps practical or medicinal role for harmala within the home at Qurayyah.
We should remember, though, you said the funerary burners from Qurayyah itself haven't been analyzed yet.
That's right. That's an important caveat. Analyzing those could definitely add another layer, maybe confirm this pattern or perhaps complicate it. Still more to learn there.
Okay, so we've looked at what they found, the different chemicals, the possible sources. Now for the really big question. What were they actually using this harmala fumigation for in Qurayyah? Why burn it in their homes?
Well, as we discussed, The fact that these burners were found squarely in residential areas and living spaces is a massive clue.
Right.
It strongly suggests the primary use was domestic, within people's homes, not for big public ceremonies or, state rituals in a temple, more personal, everyday maybe.
Okay, so let's think about the possibilities. The study talks quite a bit about potential medicinal and therapeutic uses.
Indeed. And as we touched on earlier, P. harmala is still used in traditional medicine in Saudi Arabia today. That points to a really long, continuous history of using local plants for healing.
Right.
And historically, and even now in traditional practices, it's recognized for a whole array of properties. Pain relieving, anti-inflammatory, maybe even mood-enhancing effects like antidepressant or anti-anxiety.
What kind of specific ailments?
Traditionally, it's been used for things like joint pain, headaches, toothaches, even nervousness or anxiety.
And the study specifically mentioned that inhaling the smoke was a traditional way to use it for some of these things, not just eating it.
Exactly. There are traditional accounts, ethnobotanical records, of people inhaling harmala smoke specifically for things like toothaches and headaches. Also for its anti-inflammatory effects, maybe for arthritis-like conditions.
Okay.
And possibly also for sort of stabilizing mood or general pain relief. So fumigation seems like an established delivery method.
What about using it for animals? Veterinary uses. Could they have been fumigating sick animals?
It's less likely via fumigation, I think. While P. harmala can have effects on livestock, like sedation, that's usually if they eat it, burning it to treat animals seems less probable based on how these things usually work.
That makes sense. Okay, now what about the psychoactive angle? We know the harmala alkaloids can have those effects at higher doses.
Yeah, the potential for psychoactive effects is certainly there. We know that. And there are definitely contemporary, modern, ritualistic uses of harmala that explicitly involve seeking altered states of consciousness.
So could the Iron Age people have been doing that too?
It's conceivable they were aware of these properties, yes, but, and this is important, achieving strong psychoactive effects usually requires higher doses.
Right.
And there are also risks of toxicity at those higher levels. Plus, the effects you get from inhaling smoke might be quite different, maybe less intense, than if you were to ingest the plant material directly.
Okay. So while it's a possibility they knew about it, and maybe even used it sometimes for that, it might not have been the main reason for this regular domestic fumigation we're seeing evidence for.
That seems like a reasonable perspective, yes. Achieving powerful hallucinogenic effects probably needs a much higher concentration of alkaloids than you might typically get just from burning some in a sensor in your house. It leans more towards therapeutic or practical uses being primary.
Okay, so let's talk practical uses then. What about keeping things clean? Hygiene.
This seems like a very strong possibility, actually. We mentioned the antibacterial and antifungal properties of P. harmala smoke earlier.
Yeah.
And traditionally, it has been used precisely for that as a way to disinfect spaces, to sort of fumigate rooms, potentially to reduce the spread of illnesses.
Which in a, densely populated oasis settlement like Qurayyah must have been.
Incredibly important. Maintaining some level of hygiene would have been crucial for community health. So burning harmala could have been a regular practice to purify the air and disinfect living spaces.
That makes a lot of sense. The study also mentioned it might repel insects.
Yes, that's another very practical potential benefit. Its smoke is known to have insect repellent properties. In a warm oasis environment, keeping flies, mosquitoes, and other pests out of your home would have been a constant battle.
Definitely a useful side effect, if not a primary purpose.
Or maybe even a primary purpose some of the time.
Yeah.
But the study also suggested that making the house smell nice probably wasn't the main goal.
Yes, that's an interesting point, because pure harmless smoke apparently has quite a strong, maybe even pungent odor. It's not typically described as a pleasant perfume like, say, frankincense.
Right. And at other sites in the region, as we discussed, we do see clear evidence of people using highly aromatic resins, like frankincense and myrrh, seemingly specifically for their fragrance.
Uh-huh.
That doesn't seem to be the main driver for the harmala use in these everyday home contexts at Qurayyah. The smell profile is just different.
Okay. So putting all those pieces together, the domestic context, the known properties, the traditional uses, the smell, what do you think was the most likely main reason for this harmala fumigation in Qurayyah?
Well, based on all the evidence we have right now, the most probable scenario seems to point towards primarily medicinal and practical uses within the household.
A combination, maybe?
Very likely a combination of sanitary and hygienic applications, air purification, disinfection, maybe pest control, alongside using the smoke medicinally, therapeutically, to alleviate various common aches, pains, and ailments. That seems like the most plausible explanation for its regular presence in homes.
And the psychoactive potential, while acknowledged, seems less likely to have been the primary driver for this specific pattern of use, given the dosage factors.
Exactly. It might have been known, maybe even utilized occasionally, but the evidence leans more toward those health and hygiene applications for the findings at Qurayyah.
It really paints a vivid picture, doesn't it? A community deeply connected to its local environment, its plants, and actively using them to manage their everyday health and well-being.
It truly does. And this discovery, finding this specific use so far back, it has some really significant implications that go way beyond just this one archaeological site.
How so?
Well, this evidence, dating back nearly 3 millennia, it just underscores the incredibly long, deep history of traditional plant use in this part of the world.
Yeah.
It highlights this enduring legacy of people understanding and utilizing medicinal plants from their surroundings.
It's amazing to think about that kind of continuous knowledge potentially being passed down generation after generation for so long.
It really is. And findings like this from archaeology are just so important for helping us rediscover and really appreciate these ancient practices and understand the rich cultural heritage of the region.
Especially since, as the study notes, some of this traditional knowledge is under threat today.
Sadly, yes. This kind of traditional ethnobotanical knowledge, understanding local plants, it's facing decline in many parts of Arabia and elsewhere. So these archaeological discoveries really highlight the value of this knowledge and maybe the urgent need to document and preserve what still remains.
It's like archaeology can serve as a reminder, helping us remember and value knowledge that we might otherwise be losing.
Precisely. And there's another angle, too. By analyzing these ancient plant remains with modern techniques, who knows? We might even uncover previously unknown bioactive compounds.
You mean like discover new potential medicines from ancient residues?
It's a fascinating possibility. Compounds that were used effectively in the past but have been forgotten. It could potentially lead to new avenues for modern therapies.
So this isn't just about understanding the past. It could genuinely have implications for the future of medicine and drug discovery.
It's a long shot, maybe, but it's a truly intriguing prospect, isn't it?
Absolutely. Okay, so to sort of bring this deep dive to a close, we've explored some really groundbreaking evidence from residues inside ancient pottery in Iron Age Arabia. It reveals that Peganum harmala, Syrian rue, was being deliberately used for fumigation around 2,700 years ago.
Yeah.
And this gives us just a remarkable window into the health practices, the hygiene strategies, maybe the daily lives of these ancient communities.
And it really showcases the ingenuity, doesn't it, of these early societies in recognizing and utilizing the potential of their local plant life for a whole variety of practical and health-related purposes.
It really does. It really makes you wonder, how our own modern approaches to medicine, to sanitation, how they've evolved from these ancient beginnings, and maybe what other secrets are still hidden out there in archaeological discoveries, just waiting to reshape how we understand the past and perhaps even offer new insights for the future of our own well-being.
It certainly makes you think about that long, complex, and absolutely enduring relationship between us humans and the plant world around us.